Hey everyone, Benchy here from Benchy Tests. Now, if I've managed to get this video out on time, it should be out on Christmas Day. But yeah, today we're going to be testing this, which is the GTS 240 from Nvidia with 1GB of GDDR3 memory. Now, you might be wondering, what is a GTS 240? You might never have even heard of it before, and that's because it's an OEM only card. It only ever came in packages, like a pre-built PC for example. So it never was available for general sale. The GTS 240, there was two different versions of it. The first revision was built on the 65nm fabrication process. With this one, the second revision being built on the 55nm fabrication process. The difference between those two fabrication processes are that the smaller node, this one with the 55nm fabrication process, will use less power than the 65nm one. Specs wise, they're pretty much the same otherwise. But as this is an OEM only card, you probably don't even really know what the performance is like. Although, if you're into your graphics cards, you may already have an idea, because it is from the 200 series of GeForce cards. But yeah, that aside, let's get on with the video. The GTS 240 is based on the Tesla 2 architecture, and the GPU featured 754 million transistors, built on the aforementioned 55nm fabrication process. It ran at 675 MHz on the core, with a 1620 MHz shader clock. There's also 1GB of GDDR3 VRAM on a 256-bit wide bus, running at 1100 MHz, or 2200 MHz effectively, due to the nature of GDDR memory. The G92B based GPU featured 64KB of L2 cache, and had 14 shading multiprocessors, totaling 112 shading units, cut down from the GTS 250's 128. It only needs a single 6-pin power connector, and will fit into cases with limited space with ease, due to its single slot cooler, and although it technically has DirectX 11.1 support, it won't be able to even launch some DirectX 11 games, due to its lack of support for shader model 5. Before the card died in a manner that absolutely, positively, totally didn't have anything to do with me, I did manage to get an overclock and some games tests in, just not as many as normal. And first up is GTA 5, which released back in 2015 on the PC, and remains a great benchmark today. We're using the lowest settings with 16x anisotropic filtering in both tests. 720p was clearly a lot smoother than 1080p was able to manage. There was, however, not much stuttering at all in the city. In fact, at 1080p there was only one occurrence of it, and FPS managed to get up to 36 at points, with drops down to 24 FPS happening as well. The overclock showed no stuttering here at all. Both were smooth on the highway towards the desert area, however the game at 1080p would dip to 24 FPS in the desert itself, and at times it was pretty jarring to watch. Again, the overclock was far better here and overall ran great throughout. 1080p showed an average of 31 FPS, with 24 and 21 FPS 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, with 720p showing an average of 48 FPS, a 54.8% boost in average frame rates, and 36 and 33 FPS for its 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. 1080p showed multiple spikes in its frame times throughout the test of up to 40 milliseconds, and a couple more at 110 to 120 milliseconds as well. 720p had multiple sub 30 FPS dips throughout, and had some 40 millisecond frame time spikes as well, but these were unnoticeable. In CSGO, with no anti-aliasing, the GTS 240 could max out the settings at 1080p, and ran with no issues at all. There were no lockups or stutters, and overall the game ran great. It ran so well in fact that there was no point in testing resolutions lower than 1080p. The 240 managed average 1% and 0.1% lows of 68, 40 and 35 FPS respectively. It had a few dips below 30 FPS according to the frame time graph, but these weren't noticeable during the test. As the GTS 240 only has support for up to shader model 4.0, most newer games aren't going to run at all, but one that will run no bar at all, at least in terms of hardware compatibility, is Skyrim, specifically the original and not the 2016 remaster. This has been run using the high graphics preset with 16x anisotropic filtering and no anti-aliasing. 720p, as you can see, is far smoother than 1080p can manage, There's occasional but noticeable stutter at points on the run into Riverwood near the start of the game, which 720p had no issue with, other than one occurrence where a dip to 51 FPS from the game's hard 60 FPS limit was noticeable for a second or two. 1080p struggled with inconsistent frame times in the first third of the test, and had moments in Bleak Falls Temple where the stuttering was atrocious, which was down to the game's enforced use of VSync, which can be disabled in the game's configuration files, but may or may not have unintended effects on gameplay. Using 720p fixed these problems in the temple, which ran pretty smoothly throughout the test and sat on the game's 60 FPS limit for pretty much all of it. 1080p averaged 56 FPS across the test, and had 1% and 0.1% lows of 30 and 28 FPS respectively. 720p averaged 60 FPS, and the 1% low of 54 FPS shows just how much smoother it was in 1080p. There were spikes in frame times at 1080p of around 45 to 55 milliseconds, and 3 more noticeable ones, and 3 more notable ones of 73, 85 and 101 milliseconds respectively. 720p had some 40 to 50 millisecond spikes as well as some around 70 to 80 milliseconds. To improve performance at 1080p, you could try turning down the settings to get rid of the stuttering VSync causes. So now we move on to overclocking the GTS 240. At stock, as I mentioned during the intro, the GTS 240 runs at 675 MHz on the core. Using the MSI Afterburner, I was able to push this up to 755 MHz before the card started becoming unstable. Shader clock wise, I managed to push it up from 1620 MHz all the way up to 1836 MHz. Now this was unstable, as you'll find out in CSGO, so I had to drop that down to 1782 MHz to get it stable. Memory wise, I couldn't get that much more out of it than the 1100 MHz that it was already at, but I did manage to boost the clock up to 1215 MHz on the memory. The overclock managed a decent improvement at 1080p over stock clock performance in GTA 5. It still had a couple of instances of stutter, one in the city and one out in the desert area, but could now get to as high as 42 FPS throughout the city, with a boost in the lows of 24 FPS we saw at stock clocks, up to the high 20s with the overclock. 720p, like stock, performed great here again, and could now hit as high as 65 FPS, dropping no lower than 40. The desert area of the game showed similar increases in performance for 1080p as the city did. FPS could still dip to the high 20s, but was a far less jarring experience than it was at stock clocks. 720p, again, much like stock, was no issue here at all, and wouldn't even drop below 43 FPS here. Overall, the overclock showed a decent improvement, although given how well 720p at stock performed, the improvement wasn't particularly noticeable for that. 1080p averaged 34 FPS, a 9.67% increase over stock's average at the same resolution, and managed 1% and 0.1% lows of 26 and 24 FPS respectively. 720p got its average up from 48 to 53 FPS, a 10.42% improvement on stock clocks. 1080p at various points in the test had spikes in frame times of up to around 45 milliseconds, some more of around 50 to 64 milliseconds, and one of 123 milliseconds. 720p only had a few sub 30 FPS dips throughout the test, which were unnoticeable. As mentioned, the shader clock had to be dropped down to 1782 MHz for CSGO for stability reasons, but given how well stock clocks performed, taking a little bit out of the overclock isn't going to do any harm to performance here. The game still performs great. It shows no stuttering or locking up whatsoever. There was one occasion where it would noticeably drop to 40 FPS while aiming down the sights of one of the weapons. We didn't encounter this at stock, as there weren't times where we even looked down the sights of the weapons. Fortunately, this is the only issue, and as you can see, the 1% and 0.1% lows saw a small boost, but the biggest jump in numbers came with the now 77 FPS average, a 13.23% improvement. Although average frame times aren't everything, as you also need to take into account the frame times and how consistent or inconsistent they are. You could, for example, be averaging 60 FPS, which would suggest smooth gameplay, but if you have frames on screen for 16.7 milliseconds, which equals 60 FPS, and then have a frame that stays on screen for 33.3 milliseconds, which equals 30 FPS for example, you might be averaging 60 overall, but you're going to notice those spikes in frame times as micro-stuttering, making a game uncomfortable or even unplayable. With Skyrim, despite having a lot less variance in its frame times and less frequent spikes, 1080p still suffered from noticeable stuttering on the run into Riverwood. It also had trouble on the Riverwood Trader as well, where it was noticeably stuttery on the upper level of the building. 720p had no issues though and maintained the game's 60 FPS limit throughout the entire test. In fact, the GTS 240 had so little work to do that the GPU usage was often below 50%. Inside the temple, it was much the same for 1080p as it had been at stock, with noticeable stuttering at points and lows of 34 FPS here. Again, you could obviously reduce the settings to get a smoother experience, but it does perform relatively well considering the resolution and the settings being used. 1080p managed 57, 30 and 29 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. Not much of a gain on stock, but the game's hard limit of 60 FPS kind of makes it near impossible to show much of a boost in the benchmark figures here. 720p averaged 60 FPS, the same as stock, and had 1% and 0.1% lows of 57 and 30 FPS respectively. 0.1% low for the overclock is actually lower at 720p compared to stock, but performance was good enough for it to be unnoticeable anyway. So to conclude, the GTS 240 isn't particularly great for 1080p gameplay, unless you're looking at games such as CSGO. GT5 and Skyrim had their problems, and given how well 720p performed in both of these games, it's probably a good idea to stick to that resolutions and just up the settings a little bit, or even put up the resolution as well, just maybe not 1080p. Before we finish up today, I'd like to give shoutouts to Patreon supporters Tasfey Dodge and Shadow in the Void for helping to make all of this possible. If you enjoyed this, please consider leaving a comment and a like, and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos for my Patreon at patreon.com/benchytests or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/benchytests. And if you do decide to become a patron, you'll gain early access to all of my videos for as long as you remain a patron. So thank you for watching my video. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.